friends, and welcome to yet another disability dramaturgy deep dive. I think for you it's been like a normal, reasonable amount of time between the last one and this one. I usually do them every 6 weeks. For me, I've written 4 of these back to back, and I'm a little bit tired. But after this, I too will be back on the regular schedule, and that's going to be the dream. I can't wait. Today we're going to be talking about Children of a Lesser God, about which I think I went through every possible emotion you can have about a piece of theater over the course of the research process. It's one of those things that like teeters between actively super dangerous and maybe just a little bit out of date, depending on how it's done, which is always fascinating to me when something has that much leeway and how it's produced. But I do want to warn you right at the top of this video that we will be discussing domestic abuse for a portion of today's video. If you do not have the emotional space for that right now, you are welcome to head over to any of my other disability dramaturgy deep dives, which I will link in the description below for you. Fully respect whatever decision you choose to make, but I will say that our specific discussions of domestic abuse today are going to be around the insidious kind that is most often missed in relationships that involve disabled people. So if you do have the spoons to stick around, what you learn in this video might be important safety information to keep in your back pocket, but if you don't, that's okay, and I understand. Other housekeeping things to get out of the way while we're here. Hi, I'm Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I make videos on this channel primarily about disability-related issues in history, media, and the social consciousness, and in this specific series we break down shows that either implicitly or explicitly involve disability to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be, work on our critical thinking and media analysis skills, and talk about ways to more ethically stage and talk about these shows, always with a cool "that happened, now what" mindset that doesn't point fingers, but instead lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. Because I like being employed in this industry, and also because it's never one person's fault. That's not how that works. We have a lot of fun here. I would love for you to stick around and learn something new. My Patreon is linked in the description below if you want to support me. You can also support me by hitting any of the buttons down there as well, or leaving a comment, or both, whatever sparks joy for you. My source list is in the description, along with some further resources on disability and media if you want to learn more about that, and for friends who need it. I am a white young person with light brown, just beyond shoulder length curly hair. I'm wearing a thin strapped dress that is brown and has some white flowers with yellow accents, and I'm sitting on a dark gray couch in front of a plain wall with some green leaves and fairy lights above my head. On a separate accessibility note for deaf and hard of hearing friends, as well as those with auditory processing difficulties like myself, all of my videos are hand captioned by me, so feel free to turn those on if you don't typically have them automatically on YouTube, because I know the auto captions can be sketchy at best, but I fixed them for you, so please use them. I would really appreciate it. Amazing. All right, let's jump in. If you're unfamiliar with Children of a Lesser God, we're gonna do a full plot summary in just a bit, so hang on. But just for the most basic context to get us through here, it's a play about a deaf woman named Sarah who is somewhere on the line between student and employee at a residential school for the deaf, and a newly hired speech teacher named James, who falls for her and the push and pull that comes with a relationship between a deaf person and a hearing person as they learn about each other's cultures, and also he keeps trying to push her towards speaking. The title comes from the 11th chapter of Alfred Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King, the line being, "For why is all around us here as if some lesser god had made the world?" The show began its life in 1977 when playwright Mark Bedoff was working on a production of one of his plays at the University of Rhode Island's new repertory, and a scenic designer friend, Robert Steinberg, introduced Bedoff to his wife, Phyllis Frelich, or Freilich, depends on how every interview says it differently, and she never corrects anybody because she's deaf, so I don't know. We're gonna go with Freilich because I've heard it more often, so apologies if that is incorrect. Phyllis grew up with deaf parents and was deaf herself, performing throughout her time at Gallaudet University, where she was then asked to join the newly created National Theatre of the Deaf. We'll loop back to that as well in a little bit. We have some important deaf theatre history to go over, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Bedoff hit it off with Phyllis, and in response to her talking about the sheer lack of substantive roles for deaf women in theatre, he decided he was going to create one. So together, the three of them wrote this play based on the deaf community and allegedly based on the relationship between Freilich and Steinberg. I ultimately, depending on the version, have some questions as to how close it is or not. I'm going to assume the answer is not, but either way, it had its initial workshop at New Mexico State University starring Freilich and Steinberg, and the director of the Mark Tabor Forum in Los Angeles, Gordon Davidson, picked the play up and decided to premiere it at the Mark Tabor Forum in 1979, and then it transferred to Broadway with John Rubinstein as James and Steinberg as a less experienced actor becoming the James understudy. Over the course of its run, Phyllis would later be replaced by Elizabeth Quinn, who then went on to lead the West End production and was replaced on Broadway by Linda Bove, who you may remember as the deaf actress on Sesame Street. John was later replaced by David Aykroyd. The show opened on March 30th of 1980 at the Longacre Theatre and ran for 887 performances and 9 previews, closing on May 16th, 1982, which, if you know anything about the lore of the Longacre Theatre, that's a wild length for a run to be. It's also a wild run length for a play in general. It received 4 Tony nominations, winning for Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Play. Phyllis as the first deaf Tony winner, and I believe still the only deaf Tony winner. The 1981 West End transfer was initially at the Mermaid Theatre and then moved to the Albury, which is now the Noel Coward. There it starred Trevor, Eve, and Elizabeth Quinn, and had deaf actors from the UK understudy those roles. I was not able to find any information regarding ASL versus BSL here. They're very different languages if you don't know anything about ASL and BSL. They both originate from completely different places. Editing Sydney here, I'm gonna give that a rephrase because it sounds like I'm saying that the languages appeared in America and Britain and so they're different, and that's not what I mean. They have different linguistic roots. American Sign Language is based on French, and British Sign Language is not, so they have very different grammatical structures. Specifically, not just one was over here and one was over there, which is what that sentence sounded like. I am assuming the deaf UK actors just had to learn a whole new sign language given the fact that they had Americans in the leading roles. Still have a lot of questions about that. Probably won't get answers. This production won the same 3 awards at the Olivier's as Tony Awards. Then we have the film, which is directed by Rhonda Haines, with screenplay by Hesper Anderson and Mark Medoff, starring Marlee Matlin as Sarah in her film debut, and already very famous William Hurt as James Leeds. At the time of filming, she was 19 and he was 35. Bookmark that for later. The film premiered in October of 1986 at TIFF and grossed $101.5 million on a $10.5 million budget, receiving 5 Oscar nominations, with Marlee Matlin becoming the youngest Best Actress winner and the first deaf Oscar winner. She is now not the only deaf Oscar winner, with Troy Kotsur winning for Coda. She also won the Golden Globe for this role. That's never mentioned anywhere, but apparently it did happen. I don't know why that's never talked about. Since the success of both the film and the play, Children of Lesser God became sort of a regional theater darling. Basically, every deaf actress you ever meet of a certain age bracket has played Sarah at some point, and they all roll their eyes and groan about it a little bit. It's kind of the Glass Menagerie and the Curious Incident of this particular disability group. Then in 2018, there was a revival by Roundabout at Studio 54 after an initial run at Berkshire Theatre Group. This is directed by Kenny Leon, starring Joshua Jackson and Lauren Ridloff. The cast also included John McGinty and Keisha Lewis, and Lauren was nominated for a Tony Award, but it closed after only 54 performances and 23 previews. Reviews generally praised the performances, but panned the production itself, as well as the clear age of the material and how it reads to a modern audience at the height of the #MeToo movement. But let's start with the plot summary, and then we'll jump into some critiques of the show. So the play opens with a woman named Sarah yelling in sign language at a man named James Leeds in a way that sort of implies that she's breaking up with him, and then she runs off. James struggles to explain that she left him and why, sort of framing that he's struggling with speech here, but he wants to tell us the story of their relationship. We then transition to the classroom where he is new to teaching speech to students at a residential school for the deaf, and currently that student he's teaching is a young man by the name of Oren. Oren is this radical guy. He wants to change the world for deaf people and give them equal opportunities. And then the other student that we meet later is a girl named Lydia, who is a little bit younger and less intelligent, and she has a huge crush on Mr. Leeds and does not handle it in the most subtle of ways. Also, brief contextual historical interlude if you're not aware of deaf educational history at all. American Sign Language was functionally outlawed in schools for the deaf in 1880 with the belief that if you teach deaf children speech and lip reading exclusively, they will be better off in the hearing world, and if you teach them to sign, they will never want to learn to speak because they've been given the easy way out, when what really happens is just language deprivation and then they struggle to learn at all. Not unlike the AAC debate with non-speaking people that we have more recently. But because of this, ASL did not start to reappear in schools until around the 1960s and 1970s, and even at that point, speech was highly prioritized over other forms of communication. Even today, there are many schools for the deaf that spend half of their curriculum time teaching kids how to speak rather than teaching them curriculum. So this play takes place at a time where deaf teachers were practically unheard of, and speech was still a really central part of the daily curriculum. And you don't necessarily need to know that to understand the play itself, but I do think it's helpful context as to why James is so unbelievably weirdly aggressive about speech being the only way to survive as a person, because that is what was generally believed at the time. But back to the plot. So after Oren's speech lesson, the supervisor of the school, Mr. Franklin, comes in. He introduces James to Sarah, and Sarah again sits between being a student and being an employee of the school because she's aged out of most of the class. She's 26, but she doesn't want to leave, so they keep her on as the maid for the girls' dormitory, and they make her take the occasional class. She is notoriously impossible to teach speech to, specifically because she has absolutely zero desire to use her voice ever, but the supervisor asks James to take her on in his free time as a student anyway. James immediately tries to begin teaching her, but she continues to thwart him and refuse to cooperate, so he offers, maybe this time we just converse in sign language and get comfortable with one another. And his sign language is not strong. And so she starts signing deliberately too fast for him to understand because she knows that. And then he's like, hey, can you slow down? She goes so slow as to be maddening and also almost illegible. Just like constant malicious compliance shenanigans on her part, really, because she doesn't want to be there and she's quite of a spitfire. We then cut to Mr. Leeds showing up at Sarah's mother's house to ask her about Sarah. Fascinating to me that was a thing that teachers just did and everybody was chill with. I'm assuming everybody was chill with. Mrs. Norman is basically like, I don't want to deal with this again. I'm really tired of having this conversation with every teacher who shows up. But we do learn here that Sarah went to school when she was 5 years old and Mr. Norman left Mrs. Norman around the same time, presumably because Sarah was deaf, and Sarah stopped coming home after she turned 18. She had been diagnosed as having an intellectual disability. That's not the word they use, up until the age of 12 when she acquired enough language to excel at school and prove she wasn't intellectually disabled. And so James thinks, based on her test scores, that she should learn communication skills to go to college or a trade school and do something else with her life rather than just working at the school for the deaf, which he thinks is holding her back. And Mrs. Norman says, communication skills? In other words, you're still trying to force her to speak and lip read so she can pass for hearing. And he's like, no, I'm trying to make it so that she can function in our world. And Mrs. Norman is like, all right, dude, good luck with that. Bye. Sarah and James meet up the following day and have a conversation where they get to know each other a little bit more and they start to butt heads, maybe just a little bit less. It's now softened more into like friendly banter rather than active frustration. But then he tells her that he visited her mother and she gets really mad about it. And his response is to ask her to sneak off campus with him to go out to an Italian restaurant that evening. There's a lot of non sequiturs in this play where suddenly an event has turned into a completely different thing. And I'm like, well, how did we get from point A to point B? This is one of them. So they do. More banter at the restaurant that turns into him trying to probe her about why she doesn't speak. And she's like, I like my world as it is. Thank you so much. Everybody who's speaking looks grotesque and I'm not doing it. And I don't do things I can't do well. And then continues to derail the conversation about speech because she does not want any part of it until she gets him to talk about himself. And then she offers for them to dance because she can feel the vibrations of the music, which he's like absolutely baffled by, which is fascinating. And so they dance and then end up having an argument about why he became a speech therapist, where she calls the job self-serving and criticizes him for wanting to make her over in his image. And then they almost kiss and she goes home. One piece that I didn't include in this summary, but I feel like is interesting background on James as a character, is that it's mentioned at two separate points that he was previously in the Peace Corps. And it's sort of implied that he has this general, like, I'm doing good deeds, but in a way that's really patronizing, and that's how he lives his entire life. And so that kind of frames this theme of him pretending that he is selfless, but he's doing jobs that the people he is doing the helpful thing to don't actually find to be helpful or don't actually want. And that's just like a consistent issue that he personally has. Anyway, okay, so the next day, James talks to Oren to ask for advice on how he can convince Sarah to try speaking. And Oren is already mad at him because he heard about the going out to dinner thing with Sarah and says he wants to change her and that's kind of garbage of him and why would he do that to his friend. And then that evening, Sarah and James meet at the duck pond because he keeps like leaving her notes of like, we should meet at this time in this place. And she talks about Oren's desire to lead a revolution to put deaf people on top, and she says it in a way that's like sort of teasing about how extreme he is on the matter, but then James jokes about it and she gets angry at James for acting like it's funny for her to want to do something for her people, and they argue again, and then he kisses her and then she runs off in anger. Meanwhile, Supervisor Mr. Franklin is like, hey, can you not fraternize with your students in that way? That's kind of weird, and like I might fire you over it. And then James goes back to Mrs. Norman to ask her more questions and she tries to kick him out, but eventually we learn that Sarah stopped speaking when she started caring about how she looked to her sister's friends and to the boys that her sister knew. And then he goes back to Sarah to try to push the speech issue even further, and he's like, hey, I know you're not stupid. Do you think that you're stupid and that's why you're afraid of speaking? And she's like, did you pull that from a textbook? What are you talking about? Leave me alone. And then sort of suggests that he's trying to do this just to get with her, which then leads to her telling us about how her sister used to make a waiting list for hearing boys who wanted to have sex with her, none of which ever learned any way of communicating with her at all, or like even bought her like a Coke first, but she didn't mind because at least she felt good at something and felt included, and he just doesn't get what's going on in her mind or in her inner world or how she experiences the world, and nobody has gotten that close to be able to. That night, Mr. Leeds climbs a tree by her window, and they talk through the window, and then he climbs into her dorm room and he's like, hey, I want to be better than all the other guys to you, and I want to buy you Coke first, and I want to communicate however you want to communicate because I like you. And then they have sex, and then it takes like actually zero time for the entire campus to know that at night Mr. Leeds has been climbing through Sarah's window with great frequency. The deaf community is kind of famous for everybody knowing everything about everybody all the time because anthropologically the culture is built on we are usually left out of information, and so we will all overshare every piece of information we possibly have. And so that really comes to be a problem consistently throughout this entire play, where something happens between him and Sarah, and then he's like, why does the entire campus know about it immediately? And it's like, well, yeah, that is logical based on the group of people that are here and the size of this community. And it's just a very funny bit that like keeps popping up. On another night, he arrives and they have a conversation where they dream about the life that they could have together in a perfect little house with a car and a garden and a microwave oven and a blender and children. And Sarah's like, well, I want deaf children. And he's like, well, I can't pretend to you that I want deaf children. Like if they ended up deaf, that'd be okay, but I'm not gonna like hope for it. And they get kind of frustrated about that. And then they decide to agree to move in together in the faculty housing across the street. And Mr. Franklin is like, that's cool and all, but you do understand that you're pulling Sarah away from her entire community and you're gonna have to become her constant interpreter now. And he's like, no, I totally get that. I also don't understand why James is not fired at this point for fraternizing with a student, because Mr. Franklin previously said that's what he was gonna do. And then the couple goes to Mrs. Norman's house to spend the night in Sarah's childhood bedroom, where they end up talking about their childhood parental trauma, where they each have their own things that made them feel like their parents didn't want them or would be better off without them. And then they say that they love each other and they get married and they promise to never let anything come between them. We'll see where that goes. Act 2 begins with a monologue from James while he wears ear defenders, talking about the kind of deafness Sarah lives with and how it is incurable. And then he and Sarah go off to play bridge with Mr. Franklin and Mrs. Norman, and Sarah ends up being way better at the game than anybody expected. And then Franklin makes a joke about how James is great at teaching her how to play bridge. Now can he teach her to speak, because that's what he was hired to do. Which again, at this point, I feel like the teacher-student relationship should be done now, but okay. And then the two of them go on a walk together. The next day we learn from Oren that he has contacted a lawyer about the issue of the school not hiring any deaf teachers, and that the lawyer has agreed to meet with them. And Sarah feels kind of conflicted, caught between the hearing and the deaf worlds, and she isn't sure how to hold them both concurrently, which she shares with James. And somehow the conversation turns into him trying to get her to speak and lip read, and she says she doesn't want to talk about this anymore tonight, and so instead they go inside to have some private time, but are interrupted by Lydia choosing to walk into their house and ask if she can use their television because she doesn't like the one in the common room. And Sarah gets frustrated about not having any privacy, and also about James pushing her into agreeing to let Lydia hang around that night. Then James gets angry about his hands hurting from all of the signing that he's doing, and Sarah gets mad at him for turning everything into a joke and not taking things seriously. And then he goes off to listen to music to relax, but then he's like, well, I can't enjoy it anymore because you can't. And she's like, I can experience music, it's just like a different thing. Another time, Orion comes over to discuss the lawyer situation, and he's very frustrated at how much Sarah's been like blowing him off and they're not as good a team anymore. But he has a letter from the lawyer saying they may actually have a genuine case to make a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and he wants her to help him do that. And she's like, I kind of can't, I have like a lot going on. And he's like, you really can't hide in one place and escape just to hide in a different place, and begs her to partner with him on this, and also asks James if he would be able to help them make the necessary phone calls on their behalf. And then Sarah and Oren get into this ASL only argument that's too fast for James to read, where Oren is like, hey, your relationship with that guy, it's not going to last, but you are going to be deaf forever, so maybe stand for your people and don't leave us behind and just become obsessed with being hearing like that guy is. What is your problem? And then he leaves in anger, and then James gets annoyed about the feelings that she is having about that, and she's like, this is not about you and your ego, please leave off. Later we meet the lawyer, who knows next to no ASL or like anything about deaf people, and so James and Oren pass off interpreting between each other, which leaves Sarah increasingly frustrated and feeling like everybody is speaking for her and treating her like she's stupid because everybody around her is speaking and she isn't. And that evening she gets in an argument with James as she works through all of her feelings about the situation, pointing out that James doesn't want her to be her own person, and everybody in that room wanted her to be something specific for what they wanted her for, and she's really tired of it. At another meeting with the lawyer, tensions get high about the same old inspirational whatever the lawyer wants to say in the complaint that leads to James, to his credit, speaking up and suggesting that the lawyer should just act as legal counsel and otherwise let the deaf people speak for themselves. But then the two of them have a whole argument about it that isn't interpreted for the rest of the people present, and they get rightfully kind of bothered about that because they're like, oh great, the hearing people are arguing once again about what to do with the deaf people rather than asking us what we want. But it is eventually agreed that they're going to speak for themselves and write their own speeches, and after everybody exits, she gets frustrated further with James for some of his behavior in the conversation, which is fair, and then goes off to write her speech. Later that day, Lydia has heard that things are on the rocks between Sarah and James, and so she tries to hit on him. And that goes interestingly. James then finds Sarah and asks how her speech is going, and she's fairly short with him. And then he goes to Mr. Franklin and he's like, hey, you should just make a settlement with these people so that they don't have to give these speeches in the first place, because a lot of embarrassment could be avoided. Which is a bit of a yikes. That night, he watches Sarah practice her speech, which is about how she is more than anybody ever believed her to be as a deaf person, and she's tired of having other people speak for her. And somewhere near the end of the speech, it starts to point more toward James and saying that, like, until she is able to be her own person, she is not going to be able to share a relationship. And then it comes out that James tried to get the settlement, and Sarah's reasonably, like, really livid about that. And so he responds that he thinks the real issue that Oren and Sarah actually have is that they wish that they could hear, and they're miserable because of the fact that they're deaf, and he thinks that they're lying to themselves and to others by saying the actual issue is that they're not given opportunities, because actually what it is truly deep down is that they hate themselves because they're deaf people. And then when she tries to sign back at him, he ends up pinning her arms down so that she can't say anything, and then yells in her face that if she wants to talk to him, she better learn his language, and he accuses her of lying about being able to lip read this entire time as a way to control him, and that she'll be dependent for the rest of her life if she doesn't learn to speak. And finally, she breaks free. She starts to yell back at him that he wants her to be his child and to be like him, and what about her and what she wants, but that text is intentionally lost in performance as completely illegible, because one of the points of the moment is to show there is no world where she could have speech clear enough to be understood anyway, in comparison to Oren and Lydia, who have fairly solid speech. James is horrified, but then tries to, like, reach out to touch her, and she flinches away, saying the same lines that began the show, and exits in anger. In response, he puts on the ear defenders and just kind of dissociates, and then Oren and the lawyer enter to try to pick up Sarah for the hearing, but he doesn't respond, so she doesn't end up showing, and at one point he puts the ear defenders on the lawyer. This whole bit didn't feel entirely fleshed out in its purpose. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. Sarah has gone to her mother's house, which is, like, kind of a big deal because they had a rocky relationship prior. Also, Lydia tries harder to get with James, and they have a sort of a moment, and that's also weird. And then he goes to Mrs. Norman's house, which is shown in parallel to learning that Oren and the lawyer won the case without his and Sarah's help, and sees Sarah and, like, apologizes for having forced her into a little box of being exactly what he wanted because he didn't understand her, but now he wants to, and he has learned, and he wants her to teach him so that he can learn more, and please come home with him. And she's like, I can't do that. I'm kind of worried that, like, I will try to change you this time around. We really need to try to meet somewhere between our two worlds. And she also says, you know what, she doesn't want deaf children anymore because she doesn't have the right to demand that anybody be created in her image. And then they agree to help each other together somewhere in between silence and sound. And that is the end of the play. And I'm sorry, that was a very long and in-depth description, but this is a very complicated, nuanced script where every point kind of matters. Now, the other thing we need to go over before we can jump into the narratives and the adaptations of this, I'm so sorry, is the history of deaf theater. I often get emails and DMs from people saying I should cover Deaf West Spring Awakening in the series because it was the first time deaf people were on Broadway, so there's some things we gotta clear up before we can continue. It is on my list, don't get me wrong, and the longer it takes me to get there, the more people I will have met who were involved, so the more history I'll be able to include when I do get there, but I can't cover that until I cover the 2003 Broadway production of Big River, which is the first deaf Broadway musical, and I couldn't cover that until I covered the most famous of Broadway's deaf plays, because this also isn't even the first one. The first performance with deaf actors on Broadway in the modern sense of Broadway. Statistically, there were deaf vaudevillians, they'd performed in Broadway theaters before this time, varieties of different beasts, we're ignoring it, was actually in May of 1942. During the run of the hit play Arsenic and Old Lace on Broadway, which ran for nearly 1,500 performances, Gallaudet University was given special permission to do their own deaf production of the show at the university, despite the rights having not otherwise been released. It was such a hit that the producers and star Boris Karloff invited them to do a one-night-only production of the show on a Sunday night after the matinee on Broadway at what is now the Helen Hayes Theater. It was specifically intended for all audiences, so alongside the actors signing, they had interpreters voicing the lines along with them. This would later become more codified as an actual structured thing and be known as shadow casting or mirror casting, which has been one of the standards of deaf theater for probably half a century, but some companies are now trying to move away from that, not wanting to always split every role for various dramaturgical reasons. That's beside the point. Sign language, but not deaf people, would appear on Broadway again in 1959 with great popularity in famed play Helen Keller Objectively Hated about Helen Keller, The Miracle Worker. Also on my list for the series, but we talked about it a great deal in my Helen Keller video, which I'll link above, so I'm not feeling the most urgency to cover it, but we'll get there eventually. I recently found there was a 2010 revival that flopped starring Abigail Breslin, so I do have more desire to check it out now. I was also recently given a playbill from the original production, actually, which is kind of fun. Anyway, that show was incredibly successful. It ran for 719 performances and then was further popularized, of course, when it became a film. But because it ran for so long, and really only one of its positives is it talks about the importance of sign language and of educating those who were previously believed unteachable, this brought ASL more into the forefront of people's minds as something important and legitimate, though notably American Sign Language was not recognized as a formal language until the mid-1960s, which is what led to it going back into schools, and even up until the 1980s was referred to just as sign or sign language rather than ASL, so that previous sentence is a little anachronistic, but more that it legitimized sign language as something of import and made a lot of people aware of it that previously hadn't been. For many people, if you talk about deaf culture or ASL, they will bring up The Miracle Worker as their first interaction with it and Children of the Lesser God as their second, primarily because The Miracle Worker is, I wouldn't show it to my kids if I had any, but it is technically family friendly, whereas Children of Lesser God is rated R, so that's just kind of how the generations saw ASL in that order. After the show closed, lead Anne Bancroft and the show's lighting designer David Hayes felt like sign had a real artistic place in theater and should have more of a place in theater, so they worked to petition the Department of Education to provide funding to create a theater company of the deaf, leading to the 1967 foundation of the National Theater of the Deaf at the new Eugene O'Neill Center in Connecticut. NTD became known for their local shows, and even more so for their touring company, and in 1969 they would perform a stint for about 2 weeks at the Longacre as a night of one acts, and then return the following year to do something similar. So the combination of deafness and ASL and theater on Broadway, at least for those in the industry and close to the world of theater, was not new by any means by the time Children of Lesser God hit the scene. But what Children of Lesser God did that was new, however, was rather than be a traditional play that happened to have deaf people performing it, it was a play about deafness, about deaf culture, something that many people did not know about. So not only was it a genuinely good play that people enjoyed, but it felt like it opened up a whole new world to the majority of its audience members and taught them about a new group of people they otherwise wouldn't have even thought about. The amount of curriculum for communications degrees and interpretation programs that includes this play and or film from around this era is a very notable clue as to how important it was in educating the general public around the deaf world. It then of course exploded even more into popularity with the film, which is the first time a deaf actor played a major role in a film since the silent era. It's also largely seen as one of the things that got the public on the side of the Gallaudet students during the 1988 Deaf President Now protests. Of course, Marley was also involved in supporting them on the news at the time. But the film's general popularity made the public realize that deaf people are a lot more capable than what was previously thought by the general population. The film also came out right at the height of the campaigns for the Americans with Disabilities Act, putting disabled people front and center on screen at a really important time in history in a way that almost definitely helped the cause. This was an era where deaf people generally do not consider themselves to be disabled, and instead simply as their own sub-community of like a linguistic minority. That's been a push and pull basically as long as disability advocacy has been around, but to the general public, at least they were lumped into that group. So this story has had a really wide-reaching impact on the world of deaf and overall disability rights. But back to the history of deafness on stage, because we do need to get up to 2018 for the context of the revival. In 2000, a deaf theater company based in Los Angeles called Deaf West decided to put on its first musical. It was directed by Jeff Calhoun, director of Newsies, among many other things, but that's a show of his that we have covered on this channel already. This musical was Oliver, and I do believe it was the first deaf musical, at least on this scale. It's kind of hard for me to fact check that, but it was incredibly successful, and it led to a subsequent production of the musical Big River, which would transfer to Broadway in 2003, where it ran for 67 performances and 28 previews. It was intended as a limited run. It did very well, and then it went on a national tour. Phyllis was in this production, as was Michael Arden, who will come up later. Later in that exact same season, Medoff would bring another play he had written that starred Phyllis to Broadway, and it was called Primate, spelled with a Y, and to quote the Playbill article about it, the work followed the story of two scientists battling for control over the life of an aging gorilla. Should the animal be allowed to grow old peacefully, or be tested in hopes of finding a cure for a deadly disease? The ape communicated through American Sign Language. Now, apes and ASL have a complicated history. I've debunked that before, and I will link that above, but also this show bombed so deeply it closed after 23 previews and only 5 performances. Part of it definitely had to do with the shadow of successful deaf theater happening earlier this season, but also based on everything I've read, it was an experience, and Andre DeShields played the gorilla, and the commentary on it from the era is concerned about that particular choice. Notably, he's not even dressed as a gorilla, he's just dressed as like a guy. I found both very little and also quite a lot about this play. I will cover it in some capacity eventually because there was so much to unpack. That was the last play of Mark Medoff's that would make its way to Broadway. In September of 2014, a few months after Phyllis passed, a revival of Children of a Lesser God was announced, but before that hit the stage, the 2015 earth-shattering Deaf West production of Spring Awakening, including Marlee Matlin in this cast and directed by Michael Arden, This World is Small, opened on Broadway, a show that completely changed the future of disability on stage and discussions around it, making most subsequent revivals of older famous disabled intellectual properties have a very weird and very short time on Broadway, Glass Menagerie being one of them and the Lesser God revival being another. Many reviews of the 2018 production couldn't help but compare the two, praising Spring Awakening for its creative ways of engaging the audience and of making each deaf character have their own voice, which made this version of a play where all of the main deaf character's dialogue comes filtered through the leading man, feel incredibly stale and static and out of date in comparison. Also, as we learn more about disability narratives as a society, there are things in older works that begin to feel a lot more like in bold as being concerning. Even if you aren't the most knowledgeable around minority issues in storytelling, you see them and you're like, that felt a little weird. A huge example in this play, for example, is the use of the R slur on a couple occasions, which feels very off-putting to people now, where it didn't in the 1980s. Or the fact that this teacher is climbing up a tree to tap on the dorm room window of his love interest to talk to her in the night. Or the fact that he's giving beer to one of his students, which the drinking age was lower in 1980, it turns out. I had to Google that. But let's talk about our disability narratives in the story, because there are many things to discuss. And the major thing first is, of course, the abuse of it all, which can be highlighted more or less depending on the version. We'll talk about that when we go through the 3 versions I watched later. But there's a specific kind of coercive control that is common in all types of unhealthy relationships, of course, that people often don't recognize as being that when the relationship includes a disabled person, because rather than view it as, oh, the non-disabled person has absolutely zero respect for the boundaries of the disabled person, and that's kind of a massive red flag, it's more viewed as this person bringing the disabled person out of their shell and making them more normal by extinguishing many of the disability-related traits that people view as being negative or weird, because their partner is changing them to fit more into wider social norms in a way that society views as being helpful to them because it minimizes their disability, and so it's viewed as altogether positive, when in reality for many people it is indicative of a loss of autonomy and a loss of their sense of self, as every single thing they do becomes predicated on the desires of their partner. A really common example of this in domestic violence situations that include autistic people is being forced to suppress all of their stims, which is like how we cope with the world, and so you lose all of your coping skills because all of your coping skills are taken away by the abusive partner. There are lots of examples of that appearing throughout this story. In discussions of Children of a Lesser God specifically, the literature often talks about this paternalism as a sort of savior complex, like a conquering to civilize, which we can also reflect back right on him being in the Peace Corps, specifically to Ecuador. For him, Sarah is the exotic other who needs to be domesticated. Historically, deaf people have been portrayed as isolated and lonely, which sometimes frames James as this sort of savior who comes to introduce her to the world and all of the things that she doesn't even realize she's missing. He believes that he can save her from her disability by teaching her how to be more normal, and over the course of the play, we see her slowly turn from this independent, employed woman within a community to as close to the perfect isolated housewife as she is able to muster. And while to her it may seem like it's voluntary, when you really look at what's going on, most of it isn't really. Like, I don't want to take away or undercut this character's autonomy and make her into some sort of hapless victim, because that isn't the case, but most of the big decisions made, like quitting her job and moving away from her entire community to live with him, are not ever things she comes up with organically. They're things he suggests and then she agrees to, which is a very different dynamic. We also see that as their relationship progresses, he insists that everything she does with him, giving her no room to be alone, and part of that logistically is just because, like, she has moved into the hearing world and a built-in interpreter is helpful. But in the movie, when like they go to a deaf party, he complains the entire time until she brings him home because he feels out of place there. And she's also capable of doing things without an interpreter. There are many ways to communicate, like writing on pieces of paper, but it feels like, with the exception of like when he goes to work and she stays home and tries to make quiche unsuccessfully, he is glued to her constantly, which really limits her autonomy as a person. In the play, she pushes back a bit on the fact that she's not missing things by not being able to hear, whereas in the movie, the narrative is a lot more streamlined in a way that cuts out a lot of her important pieces of pushback, or cuts the context of the pieces of pushback, so it frames her more as just like this angry deaf woman rather than having very specific logical reasons that she is angry and he doesn't understand them and is steamrolling over, which leans even more into this conquering and civilizing lens than how the play is written, framing Marley as this mysterious, innocent, untouchable creature who must be introduced to the wider world of which she knows nothing, and sort of removing or at least cutting down her friends in comparison to the play and her community, which makes its isolation stronger to a degree where at times it feels like you're watching a deaf version of James Cameron's Avatar. Like she's fetishized very similarly to the indigenous love interest in that film, all of which is made even weirder when you remember that she's like 19 or 20 when this is filmed. I still don't understand why she needed to be naked to swim in the school's pool after hours. That feels like a huge logistical risk to me. This play and film is also often cast with an age gap that highlights this inequality even further and can make the dynamic even more uncomfortable to sit through. The original productions couple only had a 2-year age difference, and they were about the same height, which really balanced it out and made things feel a lot more even, whereas the 2018 production I assumed was an age gap, and I read it as that when I watched it because Lauren felt a lot younger and she's also a lot shorter than Joshua Jackson. It turns out they're the same age, so that's on me. But that being said, also by casting a person of color as Sarah and a white man as James, you've now created a different discussion around paternalism and conquering and civilizing, and also on the potential treatment of Sarah as an angry black woman now, rather than just like an angry deaf woman. That becomes a whole other situation. It's important, however, to recognize that the play itself does critique some of this, right? Like we have Sarah fighting back against James and trying to advocate for herself and make him respect how she sees the world, but depending on how it's played, he either doesn't put in the work to catch up fast enough and genuinely understands very little about her because he so deeply believes that his way of living is the only way to live and be happy, or he just turns most of it into a joke. It doesn't seem to entirely take her seriously. Even when it's played as playful banter back and forth, rather than her yelling and him barely listening because he's very clouded by his worldview, it still comes across as constant invalidation of her worldview and deference to his own, where any compromise is expected to be a compromise on her part while he does absolutely nothing, which to some extent sort of makes sense because the entire show is written as a sort of reflection on their relationship from his perspective. Like a note at the beginning of the play specifies it is meant to take place inside of James' mind, and everything she says is expressed to the non-signing audience via his interpretation of it. And that makes him an unethical interpreter because he's emotionally involved in the situation and at times is expressing his feelings about the thing she said in how he tells it to us rather than reflecting her tone when she said it. I also think the conceit of him speaking to her in moments where in real life he would just be signing because simultaneous communication is unbelievably difficult frames their interactions a lot differently for an audience. Like if this were their real life relationship, they would communicate exclusively via sign unless there's a hearing person present who needs interpretation. And I actually think that for James, that would make him chill out a little bit about the speech thing as he got more used to full nonverbal communication and his discomfort around that. Of course, it's always going to be in his mind a little bit. He's a speech teacher, but to an audience, it can feel sometimes like he's speaking at her constantly to try to force her into agreeing to doing something she isn't comfortable doing, whereas that's actually just a tool for the majority of the audience to understand what's going on. I can't help but wonder how a production might feel on the evenness of the playing field should the entire thing be captioned and all of his spoken lines, when logically they could be just signed, are reverted to ASL, because that way we would see him putting in the effort to assimilate more into the deaf community, and I feel like it would tonally balance things out a great deal. Then he isn't speaking for Sarah all the time, just a portion of it, which creates an interesting tone of the relationship that they have when they're alone together versus when they're out with others. That would also make their actual relationship chemistry feel more real rather than him sort of just pushing her all the way in the direction he wants her to go. In so many versions of the story, the only chemistry they have is sexual, and it usually just comes out of nowhere, which makes it kind of hard to believe the relationship as being anything more than lust in the first place, which makes it feel even more like she's being taken advantage of. There's really interesting commentary in here about the dynamics of mixed culture relationships, where one culture is seen as less than and almost maladaptive, for lack of a better way to phrase it, but in the way that the commentary is presented, it inevitably ends up leaning toward the hearing perspective as being closer to the right one. It just needs to be toned down a little bit. Audiences of the original piece often talk about wondering, what's her problem? Why isn't she willing to speak? And truly don't understand it until they hear her scream at the end of the second act and realize there is no chance that she would be able to speak in a productive or understandable way, for lack of a better way to phrase that. Like there is this persistent mindset that she needs to get over her own discomfort to do this thing that's going to help her, and that mindset isn't dispelled until it becomes clear that her voice isn't clear enough for it to ever be helpful for her, as if her knowing herself and setting her own boundaries boundaries isn't enough. It needs to be proven to the audience why her boundaries matter logically before they're taken seriously. Which again is a piece of paternalism, right? Like, it's us saying, well, we know better than this person knows about herself because she just doesn't know the world enough, but we do because we get it. The interesting thing to dig through for me over the course of this research process has been how, I guess, shallow the critique has been. Up until very recently, the criticism included the fact that the story is paternalistic, but never took it any farther to ask, is this what love should look like? Or is this a healthy relationship? Because the idea of dragging somebody kicking and screaming out of their presumed shell has generally been, and still often is, viewed by society as an altogether positive thing. Any paternalism that is critiqued tends to be not James' consistent request for her to speak, but how he chooses about trying to force her into it. Analyses of the material talk about this not as a revolutionary and inherently political story about disability, but instead a powerful metaphor for the issues in communication between genders, and how difficult it is to truly listen to other people. Given the explicitly political nature of the issues that the play deals with, it is interesting to observe how in both the contemporary reviews and the film version, issues of deafness and power are glossed over in the face of the love story between a hearing man and a deaf woman. They talk about the story not as a disabled one about deafness and mixed ability relationships, but in terms that they can understand and contemplate, often erasing the disability of it altogether. The original marketing of the film also did this, playing up the mysterious woman in need of discovery narrative to get audiences in, and talked about its universality as a story about just a man and a woman who struggle to communicate and to understand each other, just like any other couple, when very importantly, it's been a lot more than that. And interestingly, all of the press for the 2018 production operated very similarly, with most of their interviews about the show being spent on assuring everybody that this is a universal story for everybody, that everybody's going to connect to and everybody's going to relate to it. And the remaining time of those interviews was usually devoted to, hey Joshua, how hard was it for you to learn this language? There was little to no discussion about disability and deafness anywhere in any of the production materials. It is important to remember that this is very much a period piece, right? Like, the idea of him climbing into her dorm window from a tree was not seen as supremely creepy back then, I think. Or like him giving a beer to one of the students because she was the legal drinking age for the time. And discussions of age gap relationships were also in a very different place back then. There are many moments in this film specifically where it feels like I'm watching Mr. Holland's Opus, where you're like, no, we have a lot of different and very strict rules on how teachers and students interact now that are not here. Like, some of the things that at the time were the mark of a great teacher who really cares about his students now feel creepy at best. The uses of the R slur also feel uncomfortable and unnecessary, though that language was still in medical and governmental usage until the Obama administration. So there's some things about it that feel real bad now that were not seen as issues then and aren't products of their time in the, like, is this worthy of critique around ableism sense, more in just like a, we don't really do things like that anymore, so that feels a little off-putting kind of sense. The movie in particular is also really hard to watch now that Marley has come out about the physical and emotional abuse she faced in her relationship with her co-star that began when they were making the film together, because yes, they were dating through this time and also after the film came out. Remember that she was 19 and he was 35 when they met, and she was in her film debut and he was already a seasoned actor. There's a specific scene in the film where you can see a bruise on her leg that is from a fight they had the night prior, and it just really colors how you see the two of them together. In her recent documentary, Marley Matlin Not Alone Anymore, which is fantastic and you should go check it out, they talk a lot about Children of a Lesser God and how there's a lot more awareness around ideas like domestic abuse and power dynamics and control, and specifically how she felt like she was sort of primed to end up in a situation like that because of the language deprivation she had experienced growing up. It didn't give her the tools to be able to notice when she wasn't being treated properly or what you do when that happens. And it wasn't until she went to rehab and did therapy for drug use that she put the pieces together about him and got out. There was a comment made by the documentary's director about Lesser God where she says, "I believed it was a love story because I was told it was," which made me think a lot about how, like, while some of the mistreatment in the story is critiqued within it, it's still framed as this sort of star-crossed sweeping romance where they end up together. And I can't help but wonder how many young deaf people saw this movie and ended up in similar unsafe situations because the film normalized it for them. I know that when I and my peers with all kinds of disabilities have been in similar situations, it's been brushed off by everybody around us as, oh, this disabled person is too sensitive and they should be grateful because this person is helping them to break out of their shells and it's good for them, not realizing that maybe if a person is obsessed with completely eliminating your personhood and ignoring your boundaries, your safety is entirely compromised. And I ended up getting really frustrated when I was reading all this literature around this piece, especially around this movie, which is light years worse regarding normalizing this abusive behavior in comparison to the play, in seeing not a single person point this out. When we know that disabled people are 2 to 10 times more likely to end up in domestic violence situations in comparison to the general population, especially so for disabled women. Over and over I read these articles talking about how, what a beautiful and bittersweet love story this is, and I'm sitting there like racking my brain, and I'm like, why is she even into James in the first place? Beyond just being chosen by another person who at least somewhat knows how to sign for the first time in her life, what is there that she loves about him or that she's interested in him about? What is beautiful about a non-disabled man turning a disabled woman who is to some degree his student into a pet project and then removing her from her entire support system? Even in the conversations around the 2018 production that said, it's hard to sit through post-Me Too, they mostly talked about it in terms of the teacher-student dynamic. The only place I was able to really find any commentary about the idea of a man trying to remake somebody in their image and then also falling in love with them is in discussions around a completely different play that nobody else talks about in comparison to this one, which has a lot of similar elements, and that play is Pygmalion. If you're not familiar with Pygmalion, it is a play by George Bernard Shaw that My Fair Lady is based on. It's actually the reason I do theater today, but that's a story for another day. If you're not familiar with the story, it's based on the ancient Greek story about a sculptor who falls in love with a statue that he carves, and it's about a man named Henry Higgins who finds a Cockney woman functionally living on the street named Eliza Doolittle, and through the power of phonetics training turns her into this high society British woman, and Higgins is a misogynistic controlling mess, and so as soon as she is in a place where she can speak and function well enough to have power over him, she leaves. Except in My Fair Lady, she goes back to him. And there's a lot of debate about the endings and the complicated nuances of both of those. I wrote a lot of papers about that in high school. We won't dredge that up now. There's also a deaf Pygmalion, and it's on my shelf, and that's what made this connection for me while I was researching this. I'll cover it on this channel at some point. Again, there's a lot of deaf media for me to cover. It's called Sign Me Alice, and it actually predates Children of a Lesser God. It was performed in 1974, and was, and I still believe is, the most popular play ever performed at Gallaudet University. It was after Freilig's time there, but the playwright was her drama teacher and is a founding member of the National Theatre of the Deaf, so she knew of it, if not actively saw it, which means it probably influenced the creation of this play to some extent. Now, at the end of this play, much like Pygmalion, rather than My Fair Lady, Alice leaves the speech teacher. She's grateful for what she's learned, but she's out. And of course, Children of a Lesser God is different than this. The dynamic is not the same by any means, but it is interesting that the ending chose to have them decide to try to meet in the middle and make it work, especially given the existence of a deaf Pygmalion where a similar set of circumstances plays out and she chooses herself. It's also interesting to me how much literature there is historically about the relationship between Higgins and Eliza being toxic and unhealthy and flawed in a way we don't see discussed ever with Children of Lesser God, because again, a lot of what we see from James, which is very Higgins-like, is still very normalized as being worth it for the disabled character. Not unlike how we treat somebody setting limits for their toddler and their toddler throwing a tantrum as being for the kid's own good because they don't know anything about the real world yet. If people were viewing this, at least the play, again I have beef with the movie, we're gonna get to that in a moment, with a similar lens to what we're talking about here, I do think there's perhaps something salvageable for a modern day audience about this piece if done correctly. But I have seen almost zero critique, which leads me to believe that it's not really being viewed as this cautionary tale about the danger of paternalism and ableism for disabled women specifically, and that much of what I find concerning about the narrative is viewed as standard by general audience members, which I find rather alarming. Now, we're going to go through the adaptations in chronological order. I did not watch them chronologically due to scheduling issues, so I loathed this thing right off the bat because my frame of reference was the movie because I watched it first and it made me very angry. And then I realized actually maybe it's an adaptation issue after seeing the original play because the amount of changes they made to the movie is frankly concerning. And then I had even more complicated feelings after seeing the revival. It was a time. If I could go back and watch it in chronological order, I do wonder if I would feel differently about it. But anyway, let's start with the 1980 play. If you can't tell by this point in the video, I liked it like a lot. I really had a good time. I think part of it is that I went into it with very low expectations, but the vast majority of the fighting between the couple leaned more into this playful flirt arguing rather than the actual genuine conflict, which made it a lot less fatiguing to watch. I'm all for a good family drama or a couples drama, but constant fighting from start to finish gets really tiresome and really one note really quickly, which can flatten characters. So having a lot of range here was really nice and felt like a breath of fresh air. The movie, they're just yelling at each other like start to finish. This is also the only version of the show where I realized it's written like a comedy because I've never otherwise seen it done or talked about in that way, but they really played up the comedy of their flirty arguments, of his complete ineptitude at handling deaf people, of the physical comedy that comes with ASL and otherwise more physicalized communication, also of the quirks of deaf culture, specifically everybody knowing everything about everybody, so he keeps trying to keep secrets, and then within 6 hours everybody starts asking him about the thing that he thought was a secret, which is a really great recurring bit. All all of which gave the actual arguments the room to breathe and made it easier to pay attention to every piece of information that's coming across. The script points out, hey dude, you're taking her away from the deaf community, you think that's a good idea. We get a moment where James tells us about his childhood and breaks down into tears, which humanizes him more as this messy guy who also doesn't know what he's really doing, rather than somebody trying to pretend they know all of the answers and lording them over Sarah like a parent. He also only gets genuinely scary at the end when he starts to feel like he's losing control over her entirely during the legal case situation, which he then is able to use as a nice springboard to be like, hey, you're stuck on changing me. I don't want that. And they decide to try to figure out how to be in between. It all felt messy, but in a measured way, not so much in a genuinely concerning abuse way. I think primarily because of how James' ineptitude was played, which made him very likable and feel less calculated and more like he is brand new to teaching, he's brand new to the deaf community, and he's really trying to unlearn this ableist dribble that has been drilled into his brain over the course of acquiring that degree. He and Sarah also feel very evenly matched in height, in age, in vibe, so it feels more for the story like she's carefully and perhaps begrudgingly letting him into the deaf world, and it's only in the final quarter where it gets too much to his head and then he backpedals. I also loved the costuming choice to start her in pants and then have her slowly switch to skirts and then to full dresses when she's turning into housewife mode, and then when she finally stands up to him, she is back in pants. I thought that the visual language was fantastic. They sort of followed that in the 2018 version, but not really. Both acts are also framed through James's lens in a way that I found interesting. The first act taking place entirely in the classroom, like he's trying to teach her the entire time, and then the second act framed instead through him putting on the ear defenders to try to understand her world. Again, the ear defender section was not as clear and fleshed out as I would have liked. It felt underutilized and this narratively confusing, but I saw the general idea behind it, but I do fear the intention was like, I blocked out some sound, so now I get you, actually, which is not the best take in the world. And if you can't understand basic empathy for other people based on what they're telling you without experiencing exactly what you think they're going through, then you have an issue. I will note on the accessibility front, this show was not entirely accessible to deaf audiences, as there were many moments where people spoke without signing, and also moments where people were signing in the dark or with their backs to the audience. But yeah, overall, I genuinely enjoyed this production. I had a good time, and I went and told the staff of the archives that they should check it out, because sometimes I give them recommendations, because we're friends like that. I'm there far too often. Now, the movie is an interesting case because I distinctly felt like if this is what a new adaptation of the story looks like as co-written by the original playwright, either he was held at gunpoint to change everything about his script that mattered, or I missed the point. Because functionally everything I liked about the IP is removed from the film, and stuff I do not love about it has been increased and focused on. I don't know what happened here. William Hurt's James feels very calculated, and because of the height difference, almost like he's always at a risk of crushing her. Like, when you hold onto like a cute little kitten really tightly so they don't fall because they wiggle a lot, but then you worry about accidentally crushing it. He felt like that, but also sort of like he almost wanted to crush her in like an unsettling, vampiric kind of way. The narrative also treats every character who doesn't want to speak as some sort of obstinate outcast who has no respect for their teachers, like the bad student in the classroom who never participates. The added scene where they connect in the pool and she's swimming naked and then he swims toward her fully clothed felt very colonizer going after the savage creature, which is like imagery I've seen in stories about indigenous characters a couple times and thought maybe having that narrative here was very telling, especially given how often that was used as a central marketing point for the film. In the film, he decides for her that she's quitting her job and moving in with him, and he invites himself to something she's invited to while he's supposed to just be interpreting the conversation to her because he can't let her do anything alone. And again, I know I'm viewing some of this through a harsher lens because I know the actual real life relationship between him and Marley, but it was such an unsettling watch, especially because we know that William Hurt was a method actor, so this was how he treated her in real life. Also, he really feels like an insecure man-child who's coping with it by controlling everything she does so he can feel better and more sure and manly about himself. They also cut the deaf rights piece entirely, which takes out a lot of the core of her pull between the two worlds and not knowing how to manage both, as well as like what makes this piece so political. There's one argument in the screenplay that's sort of a Frankenstein combination of the two arguments from the play that chose to add an extra section, which ended up turning from a moment of empowerment for Sarah to a moment of furthering his ableist agenda, which really did not sit right with me. It did look a lot like arguments I have had with real ableist abusive people, but that accuracy doesn't necessarily mean I want it on film. But basically she has her like whole thing where she says, you know, I'm tired of you thinking for me and speaking for me and you're not letting me be my own person and I'm really sick and tired of it. And his response is to functionally tell her that actually he knows better and she needs him to do this for her because without him she plays it too safe, and that actually wanting to use ASL and wanting to live in the community, the only community where communication isn't a barrier to her, is the safe option that's coming from her being scared and he's not going to hear anything of it. And then we have the bit where he accuses accuses her of lying about being able to read his lips as a control thing like he does in the play. But in the play, it feels like a singular moment of an outburst, whereas here, with that added stuff, it feels calculated and like he's discounting and has been discounting every feeling she has ever had because he believes that he knows her better than she knows herself and thus wouldn't listen to what she has to say at any point in the entire film. And also by putting her first time in this script really ever speaking about how she wants to be her own person in combination with this argument, it makes it almost seem like they have equal weight of differing opinions on this particular matter, rather than it being an important piece of her character that irks her repeatedly over the course of the piece and then comes to a head strongly at the end. And then they don't talk for a while and she goes to her mom's and starts to create a genuine life for herself while he keeps trying to come around to talk to her despite her saying that she doesn't want that and can he please go away. And then she decides she's lonely and so she apologizes to him for using her anger to push him away at the school prom, and then he apologizes to her as well, but not for like any of the things that are really concerning, and they agree to meet in the middle. Also, the moment where he forces her to speak is while they are having sex. He's like, I really want you to just say my name, and she's like, I won't do that, and he like keeps pushing it, which I think pushing that in an intimate moment like that is also so dubious and not great, and it's not in the play at all. It felt very odd knowing that just appeared for the film. But this whole sequence really bothered me so much because that argument was so clearly her standing up for herself and him choosing to turn that around and basically call himself a victim of her control game and her unwillingness to try, because for once she's decided not to bend to his every whim, and then they make her apologize. And then they agree to find a compromise, as if every choice she has made over the course of this film isn't already a compromise for her and just about a daily Tuesday for him. It's baffling. I was livid. Clearly I still am. Because people to this day still talk about this relationship as beautiful and what he sacrificed for her, and it just gets my disability rights DV activist brain all riled up. What are you talking about? This is horrific. Throw him out the window. Go live your life, girlie. There have to be better men out there. There have to be better men out there. You do not deserve this. This is not normal. There have also been many conversations around accessibility in this film. Paradoxically, Children was an example of historic deaf casting on the one hand, and profoundly audio-centric cinematographic and narrative traits on the other. James as a character is first introduced off-screen, so if you're lip reading, you don't know who this man is. There are many moments where lines are said with their backs to the camera. Marley's signing space is cut off by the camera more often than not, so you can't always actually read what she's signing. When the film came out, captioned versions weren't readily available in most places, and there was a lot of ableism toward Marley after the film came out, suggesting that it wasn't fair that she won the Oscar because she wasn't actually acting, because deaf people don't. Because we have this belief that disabled people don't act, they just are themselves on screen. Also suggesting that it was actually just a sympathy win. I will know that the majority of characters Marley has been hired to play after the fact have been very similar to Sarah. Basically, every deaf woman character post Lesser God is an angry deaf woman, completely capable and independent and a bit annoyed with the hearing world's intrusion on her life, which isn't like the worst stereotype to be created, but it is interesting that it's kind of stuck like that even to this day. Moving on to the 2018 revival. I hesitate to describe it as tired because that can be sort of a vague descriptor, but I felt like watching it, the whole show was sort of detached and stale and almost clinical. It stuck very strictly to the script, so a lot of the pieces of it matched the 1980 production. It made it really clear what is the stage direction and what was just original directorial intent. But then the staging primarily related on blue light, which made it feel very reminiscent of Curious Incident, and the sparseness of the stage with various doorways around felt very, very modern. Most of the costumes also felt very modern, while others felt like they were from the 1960s. That was kind of confusing. And then also like the text at points, right, is incredibly dated, as we talked about before. So when we're placing this in a mostly modern seeming setting, it makes something feel incredibly off and uncomfortable. They advertised it as trying to be the most accessible show in Broadway history with super titles above the stage the entire time. I don't know if they only captioned the spoken word or if they captioned everything. Those were not included in the tape in the archive, which is also interesting. I'm just saying that. But the amount of times people were signing with their backs to somebody else who somehow magically read what they said, or where deaf people apparently heard lines that were said without lip reading or watching the signing, was really bizarre and made it feel so much like this is a play and they are reciting lines, because none of it fell into the category of how actual human people communicate, regardless of hearing status, but even more obvious because hearing status requires specific eye lines in order to function. And sometimes they also had props, and sometimes they didn't have props and they mimed them, and that was stylistically confusing. And it was framed using a Stevie Wonder quote in a lot of music, which also felt interesting. I seem to remember Kenny Leon's recent production of Our Town being kind of similar in vibe to a lot of the things I bring up here, so this might just be his directing style. I ultimately felt neutral about that production. That's not a play I particularly love or have strong opinions about, but I think that specific directing style for this piece hurt it more than it helped, because it made everything feel emotionally detached and detached from any time period. And in order for this to work, it needs to be really firmly in time and in place and centered around strong emotionality. Otherwise, it just is uncomfortable. And it also felt like the actors were having to work double time in their performances to try to keep up with that and fill the space with something, which ultimately made it feel even more like a performance, which made it feel even more detached for us as an audience, which when you're not emotionally involved in it, you notice a lot of the flaws more, so it feels more achy. This version of James felt kind of sad and existential the entire time, which cut out most of the playfulness between the characters that I loved in the 1980 version. Lauren came at Sarah with the same amount of energy and spunk as Freilich did, but because of the surroundings, it ended up dulling that sparkle a great deal. By no fault of her own, she was working real hard. I was just overall turned off by the entire production. I found myself wishing I could just watch the 1981 again, but all of that brings us to the now what piece of this. And I think my answer is maybe we just don't do this one anymore. I think that's more or less already the consensus. There's no active productions of it listed on the Concord Theatricals licensing page. I haven't really seen it pop up anywhere since the 2018 revival. I tried to find recent productions, I couldn't. So it seems like that public flop sort of killed it, much like the 2010 Miracle Worker production kind of killed that play as well. Thank goodness. Like, it's something worth studying and working with and thinking about for sure, but I don't know that it's something anybody really needs or is crying out for another stage adaptation of, and I think that's just fine. I do think there are pieces of things that it did well that I haven't seen done well in any theatrical pieces since, beyond the retroactive dramaturgy, of course, of Deaf West Spring Awakening. But these are things that are very much in the public consciousness now, thanks to Switched at Birth and Coda and Wonderstruck, just to name a few examples. The book True Biz is also fascinating, and I highly recommend it, and it includes a little bit of arson if you want to be educated on deaf culture and also have some crime in your story. So I don't feel like we're really losing any of the positive things this piece brought to the media canon by retiring it. We can appreciate it for what it did and now keep it solely as an educational tool, and I don't think that anybody would be upset about that. My one and only idea on improvement in staging, however, beyond the fact that the 1980 production was altogether fine, if not great, when looked at from a modern lens with all the nuances of it being a text written in 1980, and I would also be interested in seeing a version where James doesn't speak every line, is wondering if there's a version where we stage it as being Sarah's show and framed more as a horror story. Choosing to highlight the quiet descent from playful banter into altogether argument and constant fighting and control, where she feels she has autonomy, but yet she actually doesn't, and then at the end, without changing the text at all, she chooses to leave him. I think in that case it could end up being a really interesting commentary on the particular kind of insidious abuse that is portrayed in the story and better highlight that for audiences, and I think it would balance out a lot of what feels unsettling about the story, especially to a modern audience, and also making it clear in both clothing and in theatrical design this is a period piece goes a long way as well. So if there has to be a production of Children of a Lesser God, that is the one that I want, and I would actually love to dramaturg it. I think that would be really a really fascinating and satisfying thing to play with, recontextualizing staging and all that text through that lens. We're seeing lots of versions of like The Glass Menagerie reframed, like where people are writing new plays from her perspective, for example. I think Children of a Lesser God would actually be a really great candidate for similar kinds of retroactive rewriting of her experience. I think that might be interesting. I also think that abuse-centric version of Children of a Lesser God as a 2-show day with Sign Me Alice and then a group discussion after would be a really fun time. But otherwise, I am happy to say that this was a really exciting and important part of our history, and how great it is to have a bedrock this strong upon which to jump off of and create things that are newer and better. And everything has to start somewhere. We started things in a pretty good place, even maybe the movie, just a little bit of a smidge. But at this point, this is still like the only deaf play people know about, beyond now Deaf West Spring Awakening. It's one of the only 2 deaf plays people know about, and it's really time to be emphasizing more of them, because there are so many more. There are so many great deaf playwrights, some of which are my friends, and I just really wish that we were platforming new deaf works, because we still kind of aren't, and it's kind of frustrating. But with that, I'm going to leave this one here. Let me know your thoughts. I'm sure many of my viewers of a certain age range have seen this movie and or play at some point in their lifetimes. It was kind of hard to avoid for a while there. But as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and so is hiring dramaturgs, because what do you mean deaf people are hearing lines on your stage? How did that happen? And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.